Welcome everyone to an In Conversation with Christina Victor. My name is Emma Smith and I am the project manager with Empowered Conversations, which is a project of Age UK, Salford, and we work across Greater Manchester. Christina, thank you so much for giving your time today. Really appreciate it.
Okay, a pleasure. Of course, you should be warned that giving a platform to an academic and their pet subject comes with a health warning.
It
So
might do. I might just. I do have the power to mute though, so
yeah,
within that, there's not too much risk for me. So our plan for today is I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Empowered Conversations and what we do, the work that we do. I'm going to hand over to Christina. Now I'm a bit nervous about handing over. Hand over to Christina, who's going to give us her presentation, and then we'll make sure at the end that we have time for questions from you. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A. So you can pop your questions in there at any point and we will pick those up towards the end of the session today. So thank you all for joining us. If you haven't come across Empowered before, we empower families affected by dementia to live as well as they can with dementia. And we do that by delivering communication courses across Greater Manchester. So they're online and they're free for anybody to access. We have Empowered Conversations and we have Moving Beyond Words. We also deliver one-to-one dementia-focused therapeutic support in Salford and Trafford through a programme called Empowered Carers. We do webinars like this and we have a few online groups that we run every month as well. So thank you so much. Christina, I think I'm going to hand over to you. So you're okay to go into screen share and bring your presentation up?
let's see if the technology works.
Have faith.
Oh me, you. Has that done something?
Yeah, I've got it.
Excellent. So now I've got it's not on the same screen as me. I'll just see if it feels like moving. No, it doesn't feel like moving. So
We've moved on, Christina, but I don't.
oh,
Yeah, we
okay.
moved on.
Yeah. Okay, so shall I start?
Make a start. Thank you very much.
Okay, so my name is, as you can see from the slide, Christina Victor, and I'm from Brunel University in West London. If you don't know where that is, we're about 5 miles from Heathrow Airport. So if you're ever in the vicinity of Heathrow, come and see us in sunny Uxbridge. We're always very pleased to receive visitors. So I'm going to talk a bit about loneliness, particularly in relationship to old age, but I want to try and situate people's experiences in later life within the context of their life course. And I should say two things. First of all, some of the data that I'm presenting comes from a range of studies conducted with various colleagues, and for which I'm very grateful for their contributions and their tolerance of my obsession with a particular topic, but in no way are they responsible for my interpretation and any errors and inferences that are drawn from this. So this is my take on some research I've been doing. So I've been interested, as I was saying to Emma, in loneliness and isolation ever since I read a book called The Family Life of Old People by a guy called Peter Townsend when I had my very first job as a grown-up. And then it was a topic that had a bit of a minority interest. A few enthusiasts who were interested in, if you like, the social aspects of aging, were quite a small community compared to those who were interested in the medical and or the sort of psychological. So the social science aspect was a bit under resourced. But as you can see from some of the headlines on my first slide, that loneliness has grown to be particularly characterized as a major social problem, if not the major social problem of old age and other things, largely because of a whole set of evidence that suggests that there might be negative outcomes to loneliness. And what I want to do is to just unpick some of that kind of work and get us all to think a little bit about particularly this topic, but think about some other things where we're told about relationships and health outcomes. The only one that is, I think, uncontentious is smoking. Basically, smoking is bad for you. Don't do it. There you are. I'm your mum as well. So here we are, loneliness, having spent a number of years talking to myself about this topic and a few others. You know, in the mid-20 teens, loneliness became a really popular topic. And so now there are headlines, there's a considerable growth in research. And as you can see, it's a popular topic. There was something in the papers last week about loneliness. And particularly, we use terms, or we don't use terms such as epidemic, are used fairly frequently. And I want to try and convince you, first of all, to be critical readers of the evidence that you see, and just ask some questions of some of the statements that are made about loneliness and whether this really is an epidemic. COVID was definitely an epidemic, but whether loneliness is, I think, is a subject I'll be happy to discuss. So my take on why loneliness matters is to go back to the 1947 WHO definition of health. If you were one of my students, you would now start rolling your eyes, because I really like them to read papers from the 1950s that were seminal, and they just, you know, find the idea of anything published before 2023 to be kind of positively from the Stone Age. If we go back to when WHO was formed, the definition of health was as a state of physical, mental, and social well-being. So right from the start, health was conceptualized as consisting of a number of dimensions. And over the last, 60 years, 70 years, we've really focused on the physical and the mental, but not so much perhaps about social well-being. So that's where I come from, that we should be interested in social health as well as physical and mental. And then for those of you who are particularly interested in older people, in case you hadn't noticed, we're living in the decade of healthy aging. And one of the goals of the decade of healthy aging is that all older people should enjoy a number of things, and one of which is to build and maintain relationships. So depending upon how you want to frame it, the idea of social health is seen as being part of healthy aging. So because I'm an academic, of course, the role of an academic is to make the apparently simple far more complicated than you could ever imagine. And I think one of the things we need to do when we're reading press reports, we see things on the news, is to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So loneliness is effectively a qualitative evaluation by an individual of their social relationships. And loneliness is the gap between what you would like in terms of your social relationships, and that could be either quantity or quality, and what you actually have. So only I can decide whether I'm lonely. I may have a very small social network, and you might attribute, we will send Christina to a lunch club because she's lonely. You can't do that. You can't apply that label externally. So loneliness is how I feel, how you feel about your social relationships. And I think this particular field of study is characterized by massive terminological inexactitude. So people will often use living alone as a proxy measure for loneliness. No, living alone just tells you who you live with. Social isolation is a related but not identical concept. Social isolation is effectively about the number of your social relationships. And the first person who came up with the idea of social isolation was Peter Townsend, who documented people's social relationships, drew a curve and said at that, you know, below this number of contacts a week, you're isolated. We've moved on from that a little bit, but that's the general idea of social isolation. So it's not the same as loneliness. I can count your social contacts using my standardized scale. There's a threshold, and then you're either above or below that threshold. So I can kind of characterize you from that, whereas only I can decide if I'm lonely. And of course, you know, there are other related concepts like solitude and time spent alone. It's really important that we understand what we're talking about. And so, you know, we like to make it more complicated. And I think there's probably acceptance in the field that there are sort of 3 types of loneliness. So one of which is about deficits in quantity or quality of relationships. So where you don't, you may have a number of social relationships, but they may not either be of the quantity or the quality you want. And I think this quote from one of our participants who had phone conversations with friends, but the friend was an output only device and never asked the person they were talking to about how they felt. So that's one dimension of loneliness. There's a second one, which perhaps is why loneliness has become so associated with older people, is this idea of emotional loneliness, which is the loss of a really intimate and significant relationship. And for older people, this is often around widowhood. And I think this is a nice quotation there from one of our research participants. And the third kind of loneliness is a bit deep and meaningful, which is about existential loneliness. This is particularly associated with work in cancer patients and terminal care, but it's about this feeling of meaningless in one's life. So when we're talking about loneliness, we need to know the concept we're talking about and potentially the different kinds of dimensions. We may be able to do something about social loneliness, where it's to do with a deficit in the number of relationships that you'd like. It's much harder to think of interventions that can replace the loss of a spouse or the loss of a grandchild, or the kind of loneliness that might come from thinking about deep and meaningful things as we go across our life. So I just want to use one of my favorite things, which is terminological inexactitude. Here's a nice newspaper headline that says, Britain has been voted the loneliness capital of Europe. So how did we become so isolated? So if you see a headline like that, you go, aha, they are mixing up 2 completely different things. Move on. And this is just some data from my own study, because I know what I did. You can see this is a sample of almost 1,000 older people aged over 65. You can see that roughly 70% of people weren't lonely. Around about 5% of people were lonely. About 20% of people were isolated, and then you've got about 5% who are both. So the important take-home message from that, despite the rhetoric you might often hear, loneliness is not something that is prevalent, particularly in old age. It's around about 5%. In fact, small social networks, so being isolated, is probably the bigger problem. So this is the nerdy bit for me, because I like these kinds of things. So when we're measuring loneliness, and when you're thinking perhaps as practitioners or researchers or consumers of research, what type of loneliness have they measured? So have they measured social loneliness? Have they measured emotional loneliness? Have they measured existential loneliness, or haven't they told us? Typically, we ask about frequency, and if you can see the questions at the bottom, this is from the UK's National Office of National Statistics. We have a set of questions for measuring loneliness, and I'll just check. This is asking frequency. How often do you experience loneliness? But we might think as well that there are other dimensions to the experience, not just how often you feel it, how intense is it, and how long does it last? So you will see in the literature lots of things. You'll see people referring to transient or chronic. You'll see people describing loneliness as mild, moderate, or severe. But actually, predominantly, the way we measure it is in terms of frequency. And I'll come back to that. I'm a bit of a nerdy person, so I get interested in these things. But you really do need to check when you're reading academic papers or evidence, have they used an accepted, validated measure? And if they have they used it as it should be used and not changed the scale at all? One of the really great things about the UK is that the Office of National Statistics includes these standard questions about loneliness in many of our surveys. So that means we're measuring it consistently. It might not be the right measure, but at least we're using the same measure. So then you can think about are things changing over time, whatever it is. And one of the particular issues for those of you who are interested in interventions and looking at your services, of the measures we have, and so they're there on the screen, how sensitive are these measures to change? So my reading of a lot of the literature about interventions for loneliness, that actually it's very difficult to find evidence of change. And one of the problems maybe is that we don't actually know what change looks like in terms of a score. And I won't get into that because I'm a real measurement nerd. But it's just important, again, that when we read stuff, you just think about what questions have people been asked. For my service, for my study, for my family, are these things important? Maybe we measure frequency. People may feel lonely frequently, but it doesn't last very long, and it's not very severe. So maybe it's something they come to terms with, where potentially if somebody has very long-lasting and very intense loneliness, they may be the group who we want to think about. So, okay, I'm not going to do that. Okay, that's where I repeated myself. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things we see in the press. So you can see this just because a piece of evidence is dated doesn't mean to say it doesn't have use. So this is from Jeremy Hunt when he was Health Secretary. And this is just when the loneliness issue was starting to take off in the UK. So one of the things you will see is people giving you a number and to convince you that this is a big problem. So here we say, it's a source of national shame that as many as 800,000 people in England are chronically lonely. So then he goes, as all politicians do, perhaps, a forgotten million. So we've gone from 800,000 to a million in the odd sentence. So, 20% inflation, that's probably about right. So he's referring to older people. He's saying 800,000 are chronically lonely, not defined. But that's a numerator. What we want is the denominator. How many older people are there in England? There are, it was England, yeah, there's probably about 50 million. So that gives you, so when you go 800,000 out of 50 million or 10 million or whatever it is, suddenly is much less impressive. So you want a numerator and a denominator. We need to know what the percent or the prevalence is. And this is just something, I believe this was the Independent last week, talking about the epidemic of lonely deaths in the UK in response to a study in Japan of people dying alone. Well, we definitely know that they're dead. We definitely know that they died alone, but we don't know if they're lonely. That is a label we're attributing attributing to them. We don't know how many there are. And here you see lonely deaths. You can say isolated deaths, or you can say dying alone, but you don't know. And again, thousands go undiscovered for a week. Well, there's 9,000 people were found at least a week after they'd died alone. There are roughly 500,000 deaths a year in the UK. So we need two numbers to put things into context. And this is some work from using the ONS survey. And here's a quotation from Roundtree, who wrote one of the first studies on loneliness. It was published in 1948. So it says, all who have done welfare work among the old have found it to be the most common, if at the same time the most imponderable of all the ills from which the aged suffer. So loneliness since about the post-war period has been presented as a problem of old age. And I've put this survey up because this was done to accompany the loneliness strategy. And people like me who are interested in loneliness in old age, this was quite a revelation, because as you can see, the loneliest group in the population were young people. And the older people were the least lonely, which made us gerontologists suddenly somewhat interested in younger people. But so we just had never collected the data. Nobody had ever, well, I'm not saying nobody had ever, but there weren't national surveys that included all age groups that asked that question to enable us to get to that. And that was quite a revelation, I think, for some people. And the other important part of this is that the prevalence of loneliness, if you ask people a single item question, so are you lonely? Seldom, often, always, never, that's all in the wrong order, sorry, was 5% roughly in the study by Roundtree in 1948, and in 2024, it's still roughly around 5%. So the actual prevalence of loneliness has not increased. The number of people who are lonely and in old age has increased because we've got more older people. But this idea that the prevalence, it's becoming a much bigger problem. If you use just numbers, there are more people who are lonely. If you use prevalence percentage, there's no difference for older people over the last 70 years. And this is a kind of messy graph that I just wanted to show you, which looks at people by age, and it's from something called the BBC Loneliness Survey that I was part of. I just want to show you that if you ask different questions, you get slightly different answers. So when we ask people about the frequency with which they're lonely, so that's the middle ground, young people are most likely to report that, and then it's kind of flat after the age of about 45. If we look at the duration of loneliness, so how long the episodes are, that's kind of flat. If we look at the intensity, it's young people who feel it most profoundly, and there's a nice age-related decline. So there may be that, let's say, younger people are more likely to have it, and to have it at a more intense feeling than older people, who are roughly potentially at the lower end of the prevalence and at the lower ends of intensity and duration. So if we're thinking about, again, interventions, we need to perhaps decide what problem we're going to address. So I did say I'm going to talk about life course, and it's taken me a long time to get there. So one of the things, most of our data is cross-sectional. So I go out and do a survey in Guildford today and I report the findings. So one of the things that we can do is look at changes over time. And these are both from a couple of studies I've done. So one is where we've using the English longitudinal study of aging, where we followed people up for 10 years. So we took people at point 1 and then 10 years later went back, and we took the intermediate parts. And you find that, and these are people aged 50 and over. So you find over 10 years, again, the vast majority of people don't experience or don't report experiencing loneliness at all. Got a very small proportion who are always lonely, and that seems like an interesting group that we might want to follow up. Then we've got some dynamics, people who at one point were lonely and then at the end of the 10 years are not. Some people at the start of the cohort were not lonely and then became lonely. But for me, one of the interesting groups, you might say, well, we perhaps can't do something about people who are always lonely. There might be some other psychological issues there. People are always going to go into and out of, but I thought the fluctuating group, so people, I think we had 3-4 follow-up points, were lonely at one point and then not lonely, and then lonely at another, and then, so what is that kind of group? So that's, I think, when we give a prevalence study saying, let's say, for example, 10% of older people are lonely, that snapshot, this longitudinal data tells us that there are at least 4 different types of people. People who've always been lonely, people who are on a trajectory going out of loneliness, people who are on a trajectory, this is their first loneliness, and then people who just can't make their mind up and make life complicated for social scientists. So that's one study. And then the other one, which was a local study in West London, so Uxbridge may or may not be representative of the rest of the world, and we followed people up across the 4 seasons of the year, because I was interested in this issue of loneliness being promoted as a problem at Christmas. And so we had 4 follow-up points. Again, we had 60% people who weren't lonely at all. We had much bigger proportion, because it was a smaller follow-up, who were lonely at all points. Then we've got the out of, into, and fluctuating. And we looked at which season of the year was the point at which the highest proportion of people were lonely, because everybody says it's Christmas. And actually it was the summer. And we've written this up, and I can give you the reference if you want it. But I wanted to call the paper, "Why Doesn't Anybody Ask Granny to the Barbecue?" Because we all think perhaps about involving our relatives at Christmas, but perhaps not so much in the summer. So some of the research is perhaps either counterintuitive or shows a more complex picture of the relationship between loneliness and different times of the year, and also over as we age. So I want to talk a bit about life course. And sorry, this is a bit of a nerdy academic slide. So these are some pictures of my dad over his life course. In the top picture at the left, he's the guy sitting at the front when he was about 5, and this was him when he was 94, about a year before he died. So you can see he's the idea, particularly if you're interested in aging, time is important. Time is a really important parameter, and we have forgotten, perhaps sometimes, thinking about outcomes we see in old age, such as loneliness, but other issues as well. To what degree are they the outcome of circumstances that we're experiencing now, or resultant from our particular life course? So the idea, so I have a public health background as well as other things, is looking at how previous experiences can influence your outcomes in later life, which is just what that's saying. So if we move on, so the classic, I guess, conceptualization of a life course approach is the Barker hypothesis of health outcomes in childhood are all to do with I oversimplify to make my point, are to do with your mother's nutrition. So if your mother ate well, you'll have good health as a child. And if, like me, she ate mashed potato, baked beans for 9 months, your health outcomes are clearly going to be worse. So this is where it comes from. And essentially, what we're looking at when we're thinking about the life course are, first of all, how do the historical events that people live through influence their lives? So I've got some good examples from my current research project, which is looking at particularly loneliness and isolation amongst LGBT older people. And there you can see the influence of macro level factors, which was up for the generation of elderly men now. When they were young, they couldn't express the love for the person they wanted to be with because it was illegal. So that's one example of, so now gay marriage is accepted, there's anti-discrimination legislation, the context for people's social relationships may not be perfect, but they're certainly different. So that's an example. You can think of the Second World War and rationing and what that did to health outcomes. You can also think of the Second World War because that's when women took up smoking. So you can think of these macro level things, as well as the individual things that happen to us. And one of the sort of approaches is this idea. First of all, you have this idea that there are critical exposures. So things that we typically, as we always do in research, look at the negative. So if you experience a particular event at a particular point, a key developmental stage such as childhood, that may well influence outcomes across your life. So this idea of critical exposure is going to be, it can be important for outcomes at particular when you're later life. And then there's the other hypothesis. It's not so much the timing of events, but the number of disadvantages that you experience. So if you were brought up by a child, if you were brought up in a family where there was a single mother, where perhaps in very poor quality housing, you had poor school, so you see health outcomes in later life that result from that. And what I'm currently working on with my colleagues is around trying to look at how life course events, either in terms of timing of things or cumulative disadvantages, may influence loneliness in later life. This is a terrible slide, and I'm going to tell you, this is a really tricky area to research, because we do have in Britain, we do have a number of long-term cohorts. So the 1948 birth cohort is one of them, where we've focused up, and that's the third reference down, where we followed up all births in the UK for a long time. Initially, it was about children, and then it got translated into looking at loneliness, so looking at adult health. But one of the problems with these kind of life course studies is that we're going back to older people and then or midlife people and saying, tell us about what went on in your childhood. So we're reliant on people to recall their events. But nevertheless, there are a few studies, and there is certainly from the studies that have been done, but remember, we're only asking the questions we think we should. We may be not, we may be asking completely the wrong questions. There does seem to be some link, and this is statistical, between what's the best way to do it. Difficult family relationships when you were a child. So there does seem to be some suggestion that early life exposures around particularly problems between the parents and other family, poverty, drug taking, divorce, all of those kinds of things may have some relationship with loneliness in later life. But it's a really small research field, and we're trying to get at this another way by, in our current study, we're using life history interviews, so getting people to tell us about the important things in their life. So we're not asking them about what was the relationship between your parents, was it rubbish, and therefore do you think that's made you lonely, but getting people to give us their life history and say, whatever it is, without trying to judge the agenda. But we haven't quite finished that. But I do think it is interesting, when we see outcomes in later life, to try and determine what is a response to old age and what we see about older people that may reflect particular experiences that they had, these critical exposure thing. As far as I'm aware, and I would love to be corrected, that studies haven't looked at the number of disadvantages or advantages people might have had across their life course. And we're trying to look at that. So this is the next best thing, and I'll probably kind of stop in a minute, which will be pleased to we can skate through the other things. I was involved in something called the BBC Loneliness Experiment. This was a big study all about loneliness. It was a collaboration between myself, Pam Qualter, now of Manchester, Manuela Barreto of Exeter, and we all had the opportunity, in a sense, to put our pet questions on this questionnaire. So my questions that I put in asked about, again, we had people of different age groups. So these data are only the older people because they can reflect back on their life course, and ask them about previous experiences of loneliness at different parts of their life course. And the most important thing, I think, to take from that, in our sample, very few people had not experienced loneliness before. So they've arrived in old age. They're not naive to loneliness. Most people have experienced once or multiple times across their life course. So perhaps in framing how we think about policy and practice with these people is to actually, these people are experts by experience, perhaps. They've experienced loneliness before. Have we ever asked them? And in fact, I have asked them, and I've got the data, but it's just, there's a lot of it. We never really asked them, have you been lonely before? Kind of, what did you do about it? And think about developing interventions from that perspective. So we perhaps are naive in thinking, oh, these lonely people, it must be because they've been widowed. It might be, but it could be that it's something they've experienced across their life course. And these are, again, focusing on the people who said they were lonely at that time, and again, this is only people aged over 65, ask them what particular life stages they'd experienced loneliness. You can see quite a lot of them had experienced loneliness as a young person or as a young adult. And we asked them, it was a very unfair question. Okay, guys, which was the worst? If you had to pick, what was the worst life stage? And you can see there's not much in it, but actually young adult was the one that the majority, but only by a whisker, reported as being the period of their life when loneliness was most intense. So I think it just is demonstrating that when I present that simple figure of 5% of people aged over 65 are experience loneliness now, there's a much more complicated picture underpinning that, which I think we probably just haven't acknowledged. And as I say, it takes an academic to make the simple seem much more complicated. And I just want to conclude a little bit about what we know about factors that help us to predict or understand loneliness. So there's 120 unique different factors, most of which are individual characteristics. So when we're thinking about policy and practice, are some of those measures useful for screening people who might be lonely? What's mitigatable? And how we put together perhaps combinations of risk factors rather than the analysis of single variables, which is what we do. And this is the kind of model I have in my head, is that there are things about the individual, most of which we can't do. There are access to health and resources. There are transitions which we experience, which are all individual characteristics. But it's very important not to forget how factors around the community can be important for protecting people against loneliness, and the macro level social policy issues. And I just want to kind of conclude by, we just need to be very cautious when we read some of these data, and particularly some of the negative effects these things might have. There is a suggestion, here we see, loneliness forces older people into hospital. And I think that's not a helpful thing. And here again, we've got lonely people make 30 million GP visits a year just for company. That's based on a survey asking GPs how many people they consulted with in the week before they thought were consulting them for loneliness, and then scaling it up. And as I've said, they may be isolated, but I can't tell if you're lonely, and you can't attribute that. So, and one of the things that worries me about the bottom quotation is this idea of unremitting demand, which will ultimately cripple the NHS. We think that can have a very negative impact upon older people who we know older people under consult rather than over consult. And this kind of image that, it is older people who are going to bring about the downfall of the NHS consulting before they're lonely, I think is not helpful for those of us who want older adults to access the healthcare that can actually promote a good quality of life. I've forgotten the name of the health secretary now, but I was sure to remind him or her of what it is. Again, we do have a number of strategies now, but we could discuss, whether they're useful or otherwise. And I won't go into that too much. I think we need to think about the kinds of interventions we have. There are some of my particular favourites on there. So there is work on a pill for loneliness. Is loneliness genetic? So did I inherit loneliness from my mum? There's lots of, I think, interventions which are perhaps well-meaning, but we really need to think about what we're doing. If I'm socially lonely, then perhaps taking me to go and stroke a hen might make me feel better. If I'm suffering from emotional loneliness, the loss of my child, I suspect that engaging with a hen might not be very helpful. So I think we need to think about some of the things we do, and it's not a criticism of the individuals concerned. I'm sure they're extremely well-intentioned, but perhaps we don't always get that right. And this was just something we did I did with my colleagues, that actually a lot of the evidence underpinning loneliness interventions is not very good quality, very often very small studies with no long-term follow-up, and abusing measures of loneliness. So I can provide you with the references if you really feel you need to read that. And I just want to be slightly contentious, and perhaps we should be supporting the resilience of older adults in the face of perhaps major role transitions, the retirement, reduced income, the death of your spouse, or significant others to you, only 5% of them are lonely. So, you know, most older adults are neither lonely nor isolated. There's no suggestion, I think, that the prevalence is increasing for older adults. If we're thinking about public health interventions, we like a screening test. I think there's no really good, accurate test that can predict who's going to become lonely. And I think there's limited evidence for effective interventions. And I really, really don't like the kind of narrative is that lonely old people are, you know, going to bring down the health services. And I don't think that's helpful for a group that perhaps doesn't consult or access services as much as they could. And I think it diverts us from thinking about what really matters, because I think it is quite clear that periods of loneliness, particularly long term, can compromise people's well-being. And if only for that, we should be interested in trying to think, how can we make people age better? How can they have, to go back to where I started, good social health? And, you know, in however that means in particular things. Okay, so I'm not going to, I'm just going to, I've repeated that and I won't say it again. I'm just going to give a little bit of a plug to my colleague, Dorothy Yen, who I work with, which is something we've been working at Brunel. So lots of interventions for loneliness focus upon the level of you know, going along and having coffee and meeting people. I think I've got really interested in are the micro interactions, the kind of interactions we have in our neighborhood. You know, you say, for those of us who still have postmen or women, you know, you say hello to the postie. When I go out for my run in the morning, I see the same people, we say good morning to each other. Those micro conversations, they're not your friends, but it's just the sort of kind of micro interactions that support your sense of belonging in your neighborhood. From some studies that actually feeling that you know your neighbours, feeling that you feel part of the community is a protective factor for loneliness. And so we've had this intervention. We started out in Uxbridge with people wearing little badges. It's called Happy to Chat, and you wear a badge and you go and talk to people. And you just say, hello, you know, how are you? Nothing more or less than that. And actually, we trialed it last year with our students on campus. So we have a huge number of international students. So I think, as well as these things where we get people to go and do things to chickens or dogs, or I live in dread of had my stroke in hospital and being aphasic, and somebody's going to bring me a dog to stroke. I'm petrified of dogs, and that'll be it. I'll be off. So, but, you know, thinking about how we can promote sense of community, sense of well-being, that isn't based upon some of the more interactions that are sort of bringing people together. And you know, these are some of my these are just a few things that I think when you grow up, you'll be just as disappointed as lonely as we are. And I'll stop there, because I'm sure I've trespassed upon your time far too much. And I'm happy to take any. I'll stop sharing. I have to put my glasses on to do that bit. And I'm happy to take any questions, or you know where I am, you can find me.
Oh, Christina, that was fantastic. Yeah, so if you have questions, we're getting some love hearts sent up. I don't know whether this is are you doing that?
No, not me. Normally I get axes thrown at.
We're getting, someone's got an up-to-date Zoom, because they're making full use of it with hands. Look at that, they're clapping, we're getting hearts. Never mind, get off that, never mind hearts and clapping. Get some questions in the Q&A. Right, so pop your questions in the Q&A.
I want a Zoom that can do that.
It's good, isn't it? It's right, here we go. We've got our first question. They've stopped clapping.
Yeah.
I have a real problem. This is Tracy. I have a real problem with people saying tackling loneliness.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, you could argue, if you're a kind of a philosophical inclination, loneliness is seen as being part of a human condition. It's something we all experience at some point in time, yet we've problematized this from towns, from Roundtree onwards. And I don't know why that is. Is it because we fear old age? Is it because we just assume? Yeah. So I agree with you. I think we should loneliness. So there's a guy called Cassiopo who was an American psychologist, done a lot of work in loneliness. He died a few years back, but he had the idea that loneliness is an evolutionary response to make us go and find social contact. It's actually a good thing because it says to us, hey, Christina, you're a miserable old, so and so, get out there and fight. And and the work he based it on was, I think, American college students. And I was always a bit skeptical about this. So the BBC study that I did with my colleagues, we all got to put some of our questions on there. And I asked people, do you feel lonely? If you feel lonely, can it be positive? And if it is positive, tell me what it is that's positive about it. So of the people who gave us a comment, and bear in mind, there's about 15,000 of them because we had 35,000 people reply to the survey. Quite a lot of them said, oh, when I feel lonely, I know I need to go out and meet people. So, I think on that basis, it's not always a problem.
So Helena said, really appreciate the detail and the pragmatic realism you've given us today. I'm with you on the dog thing. If you had £50,000 to spend on an intervention that would actually help people, what would you spend it on? Oh, good question.
Oh,
chickens. Would you get some chickens for that?
No, nothing that involves animals. I think, I think because with a lot of those interventions, we know older people, and the rest of us, experience losses either in terms of your ability to get out, or in terms of your the loss of significant others. I mean, it's kind of tricky when everybody else you knew has died. I think one thing would be women always marry, if in a heterosexual relationship, women tend to marry men who are 8 years older than themselves. So I would suggest you marry or have a long-term partner who's 8 years younger than yourself, and then you'll die at the same time. So that doesn't cost any money at all. Just get people to, look at a 16-year-old and think, that'll do. I think I'm quite taken with our happy to chat idea, but not in terms of the wearing badges, but I think about in maintaining those places where people can meet, and like park benches. I'm a great fan of park benches along with public toilets, but that's a different problem. I think benches where people can sit, and I think there's a lot to be said for that kind of infrastructure where people can meet informally and just get to know your community. I think we've invested too much in, oh well, that's not the right way, but trying to perhaps form deep, significant relationships. You can never replace a spouse if you've been married. My parents were married for 60 years, for God's sake. Really get much less time for murder. So, you can never replace that, but you can have a community that says hello, the corner shops where you can be known, those kinds of places. And we're removing people from a lot of those services. And so I think I'd be inclined to try and think about it on that neighbourhood level.
So the neighborhood level and those looking at those micro interactions, I love that thought about, because I was thinking, I was sat here thinking, yeah, I say hello to Tracy, the postie, and then I go and I go off and take the dog out, and then I go swimming and I say hello to people in the lane that I know, but I don't know them that well. They don't even know my name. You know, interactions really interesting.
So it's the same as my running. You know, I because I'm a creature of habit, as we all are, you know, I run the same route the same way round. I think I'm going to do it the other way round tomorrow. It will just freak everybody. But you see the dog walks. So you know, that's why dogs are useful, not for the dogs. You meet other dog walkers and it gives you something to say about. So it's somehow being able to have that recognition, and that, you know, you can say hello to the postie and nobody thinks you're weird. If you say hello to somebody passing by you don't know, they'd kind of probably have you sectioned.
Well, Christina, I'd like to point out that we're in the north, so we do say to people all the time that we don't know. There's a north-south divide on that, isn't there?
So I was at the gerontology conference, British Society of Gerontology conference last week, and as is my wont, I went running up the River Tyne in the mornings. It was lovely. Oh my God, for a southerner, it's like, why are these people talking to me? You know, do they think I'm about to have a stroke and they need to take me to hospital? It was really astounding.
There's a whole piece of research there, Christina. The north-south divide. Are people in the south more lonely? Discuss. But before we go into silliness, or maybe not silliness, Rathu said, "Thank you for your brilliant presentation," and we don't have many minutes left. Can I ask? No, it was me being silly. Can I ask, was any work done around tackling loneliness and how that impacted on the diagnosis of depression?
Probably. That will probably be more in the purview of psychology, and it depends what you mean by depression. So depression is and because we have so many cross-sectional studies, we know that depression and loneliness are related. But are you depressed because you're lonely, or lonely because you're depressed?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Oh, Helen's put some big words in here. Spaces that are conducive to conviviality.
Yeah.
Brilliant. As someone recently widowed, I completely agree that you can't replace that depth, but everyday friendliness provides a levity that gets you through. Thanks so much.
Yeah, and it is so, you know, my mum was widowed after, you know, as I say, 60 years, and everybody thought she was lonely, you know, because how could she not be? Her family consisted of me and my son and one niece. So she was definitely had a very small social network, but she wasn't lonely because the 2/3 of that very small sample were really really important to her, and that was all she needed. But she also had these sort of her community was a bit convivial, not amazingly so, but she was known at the shops, and that worked fine ish.
I'm gonna end it there because we've run over a little bit, but Christina, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I'm gonna save it all and put it onto YouTube and share it out and carry on the conversations with people. This is our last webinar before the summer, so thank you all very much. I think we're coming back in September looking at dementia in prisons, so if that's tickles your fancy, then join us.
I will, yeah. And you know, I thank you for letting me share my enthusiasms with you. You've got my contact details on the slide. If you've got a question, please send me an email. If you don't, and this is important, if you don't get a reply in 2 days, just send me another one, because I get about 300 a day because of my other roles at Brunel. So please, if you ask me a question and I don't reply, please nag.
Permission to nag. Thank you so much, Christina. I hope that you all have a lovely afternoon. Get yourself out for a walk. Let on to the people that you walk past, and I will see you all again soon. Take care.
Great.